All right, in Module 5, we talk about sampling. And sampling is really just answering one simple question. That question is, who's in your study? So the definition of sampling is here on the slide. It's the act, process, or technique of selecting a suitable sample or a representative part of a population for the purpose of determining parameters or characteristics of the whole population. So, like I said, that's a fancy definition that says sampling is asking the question, how are we going to find the people to participate in the sample? Who are they? How do we find them? What is that process? That process is called sampling. And the way you're going to do that is by considering your population, using something called a sampling frame if it's available, and we'll talk about that, and then figuring out what are the parameters of who you want to include in your study. Sometimes we call those inclusion and exclusion criteria. So they might be things like geographic boundary or age or race, or just kind of figuring out like who qualifies to be in the sample. When we are considering selecting a sample strategy, which is the next thing you're going to do in a draft paper, and we're also going to have a chance to really practice in the discussion board for this module. So when we are considering what's the best sampling strategy for a given study, we're going to want to make sure that we have considerations of all of the following things. So is random selection necessary? We'll talk a little bit about random selection. How do we identify a sampling frame if there is one? And we'll talk about what a sampling frame is. Accounting for non-response bias. Non-response bias is an important concept. Make sure you look in your textbook for more on it. But it's essentially asking the question, who doesn't respond? And so you want to consider that. Sample size is always a big question. How many people, right? How many people should be in the sample? And there are some general guidelines on that. There's no definitive answer to how many people need to be in any given research study. But there are some guidelines. Qualitative studies can have significantly smaller sample sizes. Quantitative, especially kind of causality based things, need to have larger sample sizes. Homogeneity of the population makes a big difference in terms of sample size, so you want to pay attention to that as well. But what we are going to focus on today in this mini lecture is understanding the different sampling strategies. The first thing I want to remind you of, if you haven't already found it, is that in this module's materials, there is a Word document handout that's just called, I think it's called Sampling Strategies, that provides a really good summary. I pulled it from another website, but provides a really good summary of everything that I talk about here in the next 5 or 6 slides. So it's a good study tool and just a good resource for you to have that summarizes the 8 different sampling strategies we're going to talk about. So the first thing to understand is that sampling strategies fall into one of 2 categories: non-probability samples and probability samples. And the big difference between the two is randomization. So non-probability samples are samples that are more suitable for exploratory and descriptive models. Qualitative research only ever has to be non-probability sampling. But the downside of non-probability sampling is you can't really generalize from a non-probability sample to the larger population. But sometimes a non-probability sample is the best you can do because there is no sampling frame. Remember I said we were going to say more about sampling frames. So a sampling frame is essentially a list of every person in your population. I'm going to say that again. A sampling frame is a list, an exhaustive list of every person in your population. So for example, if you are doing a research study of that's looking at incarceration rates, you have to ask yourself, is there an exhaustive list of every person currently incarcerated in America? And then find that list if you think that list exists, or create it, and we'll talk about that with some of the other sampling strategies. So if there is no list, and often in exploratory research in particular, there is no list, then the best you can do is a non-probability sampling strategy. If your study is really about kind of the explanatory end of that continuum, then you need to use a probability sampling strategy. The kind of definition of probability sampling is that randomization means that all members in that population have an equal chance of being selected. So not only do we have an exhaustive list of everyone in the population, but then we use a sampling strategy that ensures every person on that list had an equal opportunity of being chosen. So you may have already realized as I was talking that I was using a lot of the language that we've been using on this continuum thus far. And so these are the next two pieces of that continuum here in orange. So again, non-probability sampling strategies on that end of the continuum that are more qualitative and exploratory in nature. All right, so in the next 8 slides are one slide for each of the sampling strategies. Again, there's more detail on each sampling strategy, what it is and how you would use it on the sampling handout that's in the module and also in your textbook. There are 4 non-probability sampling strategies. The first is convenience sampling, and this picture you might recognize as Jay Leno. The best example of convenience sampling is jaywalking. So he does a segment on his show where he just stops people in the streets, right? Like on the streets of LA or Disneyland or whatever, and just randomly stops people and asks people questions. That's a convenience sample. It would be the same thing as if you were doing a study on Trinity students and did it by just stopping Trinity students as they walked in and out of the library. So you don't know anything about the people, you're just stopping them. That's convenience sampling. Convenience sampling works really well for kind of public opinion sort of questions. And so that's something to consider. Then there's something called purposive sampling. We sometimes also call this judgmental sampling. But essentially, all purposive sampling is using someone else's prior knowledge of the population to help you identify people. So for example, if you were doing a research study and you wanted to interview children of divorced parents, there's not really a list of all children of divorced parents, but you could go to a school and ask a school social worker to connect you with students who she knows come from divorced families. That would be a purposive sample based on her previous knowledge of the population. Another sampling strategy is called snowball sampling. And snowball sampling is exactly what this picture demonstrates. We use it in qualitative studies in particular, and we use it in qualitative studies, and we use it in studies where it's a particularly highly stigmatized or hard to reach population. So like the homeless population, we do a lot of snowball sampling with. And snowball sampling is exactly what this bottom picture shows. It's talking to one person, and then at the end of that interview saying, do you know anybody else who meets these criteria? And then they give you some names. And then you interview those people and you say, do you know anybody else? And they give you some names. And so it's using your sample, the people in your sample, to identify other people. It's a really good sampling strategy to use for a lot of social work and criminal justice topics, actually. And then the last non-probability sampling strategy is something called quota sampling. Quota sampling is essentially convenience sampling with an effort to ensure a certain distribution of demographic variables. So for instance, we want to ask people, a kind of public opinion question, but we want to make sure that we get equal number of men and women, or we want to make sure that at least half of our population is minority. So it's kind of setting up particular quotas about specific characteristics within that population. That's called quota sampling. Okay, and then these next 4 are probability sampling strategies. So remember, probability sampling means we have a sampling frame. If you don't have a sampling frame, you can't use probability sampling. So the first thing you're going to ask yourself is, what's the sampling frame? And if you have one, you could use one of these 4 strategies. The first one's called simple random sampling, and I'll tell you, bottom line, nobody uses it. And so it's a pretty laborious, and it requires a computer program. Most people don't really do it. What most people do is something called systematic sampling. So systematic sampling is choosing every kth, every nth, they always say kth, every kth element in a total list, and then selecting at random. So again, based off your sampling frame, right? So if you were doing a study of Trinity students, we have a list of all students currently at Trinity, and so you would get that list, and then you would say, I want to take a random systematic sample, meaning I'm going to choose every 10th person on the list. That would be systematic sampling. A pretty common use. Then there's something called stratified sampling. Stratified sampling is the probability sampling version of quota sampling. So same basic concept. We want to make sure we get the same number of men and women. Then we might take that list of all of the Trinity students and split it into two lists. A list of all of the guys and a list of all the girls. And then choose every 10th from each list. And that would ensure that we would get the same number of men and women, for instance, just using gender as the example there. So you can use stratified sampling if, again, there's a specific kind of demographic element that you want to make sure has equal representativeness. Then there's something called cluster sampling. And cluster sampling is used when it's impossible or impractical to get that whole sampling frame. And essentially what cluster sampling does is it creates a sampling frame in pieces. The best example I can give you of this is if we were doing a survey of all church-going people in America. There's not necessarily a list of all church-going people in America, but there are membership lists in individual churches. And so you could build a sampling frame by getting a list of this Baptist church and this Methodist church and this Catholic church, and you get the idea. And then building a bigger list from those individual pieces. So sometimes that's useful, just something to kind of keep in mind. Okay, so then this leads to our discussion board activity. I think the best way to make sure you really understand the differences in these 8 sampling strategies and why you would use them is to practice. And so this information is also in the discussion board activity. I just wanted to explain it real quick here at the end. And that is that everyone's going to be given a research topic. They're actually past research topics that students in classes that I've taught before have used. And then for your research topic, you're going to think about how you could use each of the probability sampling strategies we just talked about. You're going to post about what it would look like for it to answer that question with a convenience sample, with a purposive sample, with a snowball sample, with a quota sample, with a systematic sample, with the stress. So you're essentially giving 7 different descriptions. And then you're going to choose the best option and tell us why. So after thinking about what it would look like to use each of these sampling strategies, you're going to say, for this research topic, I think the best strategy would be to use purposive sampling, and here's why. So that's the idea for the discussion board. And I think by doing that, it'll give you a good opportunity to kind of practice thinking critically about the pros and cons of each sampling strategy. So pay attention to that handout. Do the reading and the quiz, and then I will hear from you on the discussion board.